Welcome to The Debate. Today, we're diving deep into what is, well, arguably the most defining American television achievement of the 21st century, the neo-Western crime drama Breaking Bad. The series is universally lauded not just for its stunning visual style, but for its central thesis, the meticulous and I think heartbreaking moral descent of Walter White.
And that moral descent is precisely what we're here to dissect. I mean, the transformation of this dispirited high school teacher into the ruthless drug kingpin Heisenberg, it's the gravitational center of the entire series.
Absolutely. But the critical question, the moral engine that powers all 62 episodes, it remains a lightning rod for debate. Was Walt's terrifying shift into criminality a necessary reaction to crushing external forces, primarily his fatal cancer diagnosis and financial ruin? Or was the cancer merely the excuse, an inevitable revelation of his true, deeply rooted, prideful nature?
I'm going to argue today that the cancer was nothing more than a license. It was the catastrophic opportunity Walt needed to finally unleash his suffocating ego and his desire for absolute control. I believe that darkness was always deeply latent, and the monster was simply waiting for permission to emerge.
And I take the position that the narrative, particularly through its initial tragic framing, demands we view Walter White as a figure whose radical actions were critically catalyzed by the ticking clock of his diagnosis. His motivations began pure and simple, as a devotion to securing his family's financial future before he died.
That sounds like a powerful argument for tragedy. But I come at it from a very different way.
Well, to understand that latent ego, we have to first address the tragic context you seem to dismiss, the diagnosis. Walter White is introduced to us as a man who is financially and professionally humiliated, working a secondary job at a car wash, burdened by massive debt, and then he's delivered a death sentence. His initial collaboration with Jesse Pinkman was so clearly rooted in providing for his family. I mean, the show's very structure, the famous Mr. Chips to Scarface arc, it suggests this descent was forced, not inherently chosen. It's an exploration of how external pressure can warp ordinary morality.
I respect the Mr. Chips framework. I do. But I believe that interpretation allows Walter far too much moral wiggle room. If his motivation was pure financial necessity, the solution was readily available to him, and very early on. The true tipping point wasn't the cancer itself, that was the physical threat, but the subsequent rejection of financial aid offered by his former Gray Matter co-owners Gretchen and Elliot Schwartz in the first season.
The moment he threw away millions, simply because it was charity, yes, a key moment.
Exactly. And that rejection was rooted entirely in his profound issues of, masculine pride and humiliation. He couldn't accept charity from the people who succeeded where he felt he had failed. That ego provided the direction, turning a need for money into a need for power and self-validation. Look at his rapid assumption of the alias Heisenberg. He didn't just seek anonymous financial security, he sought a notorious reputation. The power and self-aggrandizement quickly, and I mean quickly, superseded any simple plan for college tuition funds. The ego was primary.
I think that's a highly psychological reading of a very practical problem, dying and leaving your family destitute. You claim the family motivation was always a front, but even the hardened criminals around him bought into it, or at least they used it to manipulate him. How do you explain Gus Fring validating this exact narrative to keep him compliant?
I see why you think that, but that sounds like justification, not devotion. Gus Fring, a criminal genius and master manipulator, was simply applying the pressure point he knew worked best on Walter White. His wounded pride masked his patriarchal responsibility. When Gus told Walt that it is a man's job to provide for his family, even if he is unloved, he was offering a convenient moral shield that Walt desperately needed to remain functional.
But the fact that Walt needed that shield proves the original intent, however warped it became, was still present. It shows that he had to justify his actions by relating them back to his family. So I ask you, when, precisely, did that justification become completely and utterly unbelievable?
The moment the money surpassed any reasonable need.
You're letting him off too easily by clinging to that early justification. Let's look at the ultimate proof point, the series finale. After amassing $80 million US, a sum no man needs for college tuition. That's emperor money. And successfully escaping, he was long past the point of providing. His final, utterly frank admission to Scholar was the unvarnished truth. I did it for me. I liked it. I was good at it. And I was alive. The money was just the score, the power, the identity, the feeling of reclaiming his life. That was the true driving force.
The self-awareness of that final confession is powerful, absolutely. But that doesn't just negate the catastrophic circumstances that started the whole domino effect. The cancer diagnosis, the financial collapse, these created the crucible in which that ego was allowed to boil over. The reality of dying is what determined his path from beginning to end. If he hadn't been facing death, that ego would have just remained locked inside the classroom, simmering over minor slights.
I disagree. I think that ego was already leaking out. But let's do this. Let's force a timestamp moment. When did Walter cross the definitive moral line that proves his nature was fully corrupted? I argue the moment was crystalline and irreversible, allowing Jane Margulis to choke to death in the season 2 finale.
Oh, the Jane scene is, it's devastating, no question.
But it's more than devastating, it's definitive. This was an act of non-prevention done purely for self-preservation and, securing Jesse's reliability. It wasn't self-defense or even defending his family. It was cold calculation focused entirely on protecting his growing business empire. This passive moral failure, it shows that Mr. Chips was dead and Heisenberg had fully taken the wheel. He watched a young woman die so his cash flow wouldn't be interrupted.
While horrifying, non-action is still distinct from, say, the planned execution of a rival. It's a passive moral failure as it shows his desperation and calculation, yes, but I would argue that moment only works to illuminate his transformation because it stands in sharp contrast to the character who serves as the show's true moral compass, Jesse Pinkman.
Jesse is crushed because he still had a moral feeling. Walt surgically excised his in favor of ego.
Exactly. And the consequence of the Jane incident is what matters. It crushes Jesse with guilt, driving him directly into rehab, constantly traumatized by the violence they commit. Walt, conversely, exhibits this chilling, immediate lack of conscience regarding her death. And this structural contrast is crucial. Jesse is destroyed by the moral weight of their actions, showing he was a lost soul trying to find his way out. Walt, on the other hand, becomes hardened, proving the criminal lifestyle warped his initial humanity, rather than confirming he was simply born a monster.
I think Jesse's trauma just highlights Walt's inherent malice. Jesse may have been a willing participant in the cooking, sure, but he was a perpetual victim of Walt's manipulation.
Speaking of moral consequences, we have to talk about Skylar, because the audience's judgment of her says everything about how they viewed Walt.
You're referring to the highly publicized audience bias, where Skylar became widely criticized and deemed unsympathetic, often seen as an obstacle to Walt's anti-hero journey. The animus toward her was confounding, and rightly called out as a massive flaw in how audiences received the show, revealing a deep gendered bias toward the charming male anti-hero.
Precisely. Fans rooted for the villain, Walter, and they chastised a woman who was attempting to protect her children from him. It suggests that the audience was complicit in accepting Walt's initial justification, the need to provide, long after it ceased to be true.
I absolutely agree with the assessment of audience bias, but we also have to recognize Skylar's agency and her own moral compromises. She moved beyond being a pure victim when she actively decided to conspire with Saul Goodman to launder the millions in earnings. Her decision to use Ted Benicki's company to facilitate the operation, that means she endorsed or at least strategically facilitated the continuation of the empire. She became morally compromised, not just an unwilling recipient of criminal funds.
But was that truly an endorsement? Or was it a desperate tactical move to save her children from ruin, both financial and criminal, in a world Walt violently created? It's survival. She was adapting to a lethal environment. To draw an equivalence between Skylar's terrified complicity and Walt's calculated, prideful choice to build an empire is, well, it's letting Walt off far too easily. Her decisions showed the terrifying ripple effect of his original choice to break bad.
That ripple effect is undeniable, and that brings us to the ultimate cost. Hank Schrader. Hank, the law enforcement pillar, who started out as comic relief. He became obsessed with tracking down Heisenberg.
And that obsession, though legally righteous, arguably cost him his life. I mean, Hank successfully tracked Walt's money. He successfully arrested him. But the sheer arrogance of both Walt refusing to let his brother-in-law succeed, and perhaps Hank's own pride in the chase, it allowed the violent element, Jack Walker's gang, to catch up. Hank was killed gathering evidence.
Hank's death is the inevitable climax. It reframes the whole show, doesn't it? Hank was the man on the legal side who was swallowed by the same hubris and obsession that drove Walt. They were both obsessed with controlling the outcome and claiming the victory. Hank simply wanted to be the hero who caught the monster. Walt wanted to prove he was superior to everyone around him.
And that superiority complex brings us back to the show's literary framing,
which focuses entirely on inevitability. The famous Ozymandias episode, referenced by the Percy Bysshe Shelley poem, it explicitly connects Walt to a tyrannical ruler punished for grandiose projects that serve an individual's egotism. His catastrophic end, losing his fortune, his son's respect, his family, and finally his life, was not a tragedy in the classical sense, but a necessary comeuppance for a character who deliberately abandons the light for the darkness, driven by that tyrannical pride.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the late-game awareness? For a man so defined by egotism, his final moments suggest a flicker of the original Walter White. He secured the remaining money for his family through that masterful manipulation of the Schwartzes. He poisoned Lydia, ensuring his operation's final loose end was tied up, and critically, he finally made amends with Skylar, admitting his true motives.
I see those as incredibly selfish acts of control. Securing the money via the Schwartzes ensures his legacy. He gets the final win. Killing Lydia is self-serving vengeance. And the confession to Skylar, while honest, is still an act of claiming ownership over the chaos. It's the final performance of the great Heisenberg. He took credit for the damage he wrought.
But if the diagnosis hadn't given him a deadline, none of those things would have happened. His life's trajectory, his eventual demise, and his ability to achieve that late-game emotional closure, they are all fundamentally tied to the necessity of his impending death. He had to be forced to act.
I maintain he had to be forced to stop pretending. The confession just confirmed the truth of his identity all along. He was simply good at being bad. And Jesse's escape in the end, his final moment of freedom in El Camino, it stands as the show's only truly hopeful moment, the possibility of recovery, which just underscores how dark and chosen Walt's path truly was.
Walter White's life became a dark testament to the idea that severe external forces, a terminal illness, financial precarity, can provide the necessary conditions for moral corruption. The cancer diagnosis opened a door to a darkness that, while perhaps latent, would have otherwise remained sealed. His descent was a tragedy rooted in a choice forced upon him by circumstance.
And Walter's story confirms that moral agency is defined by the choices made after that external pressure is applied. The cancer was the opportunity, but the true driving force was a deep-seated, crippling pride that eventually consumed everything he claimed to love. He chose ego over family, fulfilling his need to be alive and respected as Heisenberg.
The fact that we are still dissecting this fundamental question, what defines a man as bad, his actions, his motives, or his conscious decision, is exactly why the show will endure.
Absolutely. It makes us question our own morality. As we rooted for a man who literally admitted, "I did it for me."
Did we root for the villain? And what does that say about us?